Our keynote address today is being given by the Reverend Dr. James W. Farwell, PhD. He's a professor of theology and liturgy at Virginia Theological Seminary, the seminary. His fields of expertise include liturgical and sacramental theology, liturgy, suffering and trauma, theories of ritual and religion, comparative theology, and theologies of religion. He has a bachelor's degree from Catholic University of America, his master's in divinity from the General Seminary in New York City, and his PhD from Emory University. As a member of the American Academy of Religion, the Society for Comparative Theology, and the North American Academy of Liturgy, Dr. Farwell is the founding convener of the Seminar on Liturgy and Comparative Theology. He has served on the board of directors for Church Pension Fund, Morehouse, Seabury, and Church Publishing, and was the East Coast consultant for the NBC television series, The Book of Daniel. Dr. Farwell has written numerous books, chapters, essays, and journal articles on liturgy, sacramental theology, prayer book revision, dual religious belonging, and learning across many religious traditions. And he's the author of several books. This is the Night, Suffering, Salvation, and Liturgies of Holy Week, and the Liturgy Explained. And Dr. Farwell, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Duke or Diane, would you sort of just give me a quick update in case anything has developed or shifted in the long process of bringing this conference to fruition? Just update me on how long you would like me to go. Sorry, you're still unmuted, I think.
As long as your heart desires.
Okay.
We don't have another session for a while.
Okay.
I was assuming you'd go 45 minutes to an hour.
That was what I
was
was
assuming. Take as much time as you need. And we're just blessed to have you with us, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, yeah, that's about what I had in mind. So let's jump right in, and I'm hoping that we will have some opportunity for Q&A. That is always a challenge on Zoom, but I'm sure we can figure out how to do it. We've been doing this for about 1.5 years or 2 years now, most of us in one way or another. So thank you for the invitation to be with you. It's been a long road. I think originally I was invited to be with you when you were going to be in Seattle, and then of course we know what happened with all of that. And so I'm very grateful to join you by Zoom. I must say that Zoom is a whole lot more fun when I'm not also teaching every class and attending every meeting in my life also on Zoom. So we're back in person here at Virginia Seminary and sort of feeling our way like all of you all are, like everybody is in terms of, you know, risk tolerance and public health protocols and so forth. So we're back, and everybody that can be vaccinated is vaccinated, and we are very much hoping as we head into the winter that we do not have to pivot online again. I think we figured out how to do it, but I don't think any of us particularly loved it. So it'd be nice not to have to go back again, and it's wonderful to have the students and faculty all back in residence again with all the cautions built in. So what I said that I would reflect on with you all today under the, you know, sort of biblical riff title of passing on what we have received is that I would reflect a little bit on what we have learned in the last half century of time that has passed since the sort of liturgical movement formally in the 20th century, which gave us our 79 prayer book and a lot of changes to the liturgies of other communions as well. And then I will reflect a little bit about what we have learned from the pandemic. And then finally, After sort of laying those things out, I'll say a little bit about what I think lies ahead of us. That third section comes with the, disclaimer stamped on it that I don't have a crystal ball and none of us ever really knows exactly what's coming. Futurology is always a risky affair because the future never moves in a direct vector on the line that we're in from present to future. So there will be surprises and zigs and zags, but I will tell you what I think I see ahead of us, liturgically speaking, and then we will have some time for Q&A. And in fact, I need to put my little alarm on here, so because we academics, we can just go on forever. So that's the plan. Let's start, I think, with thinking a little bit about what we've learned from the last half century. That alone could be a whole lecture. And as vergers, with your interest in liturgy and your involvement in liturgy, I think that you could identify many of these things that I'm going to identify and some more besides. But what I want to lift up are the ones that I think have been particularly significant and also in one way or another form a web of conditions within which we dealt with the pandemic and within which we're thinking about how we're going forward with liturgy in the Episcopal Church. Some of these things I say will very much apply to communions beyond the Episcopal Church, but I'm only today trying to speak of just the Episcopal Church and won't try to extend my reach any more beyond that in the time we have available. So back before the pandemic, when we were preoccupied, among other things, with revision of the prayer book or possible revision of the prayer book, which you all will know we have been talking about for 15 years or something now, and for more really, and have not really had the opportunity while facing other challenges to really turn toward that. But you'll recall that General Convention 2018, the last one that we were able to meet in person, actually took up this question of whether it was time to revise the prayer book. And what emerged from the debate at that General Convention, again, as you may know, but this is catching up those who might not have followed it, what emerged was a kind of, certainly some enthusiasm for liturgical revision, but also a great deal of hesitation, particularly in the House of Bishops, about going forward with revision when we have so many other things sitting on our plate at the moment that may be more pressing. At least that was the argument. I'm not signaling that I agree with that. But there was considerable dis-ease in moving into a full-scale revision of the prayer book. And very long and dramatic story short, what ended up happening at that convention is a passing of a resolution that both memorialized the 1979 prayer book as a continuing resource for our usage, while at the same time then looking forward toward how we might supplement that book and renew the liturgies of that book in terms of the way that we celebrate them and catechize about them. So that we had a kind of a both and way of moving forward. Now, don't ask me exactly what it means to memorialize the prayer book, because when conventions and councils memorialize things, nobody really knows what that means exactly. Sometimes it's just to signal something of importance that the gathering wants to be, wants to be grateful for. But in this particular case, it was a way of softening any concern that we were going to try in the next 10 to 12 years to jettison the 79 book for a whole new book when there were concerns about so many other things on our plate, but still allow us to make some progress in liturgical renewal. And what happened is that an interim body was set up whose task was primarily to reach out around the church, connect with bishops, connect with diocesan liturgical commissions where they exist anymore, connect with other sources on the ground to get a sense of what kind of experimentation was going on liturgically in the Episcopal Church, and to begin to take the temperature, if you will, of where substantial changes and shifts might be occurring. And of course, the open secret beneath that purpose is that it's never been the case that every Episcopal church on any given Sunday morning is all doing exactly the same thing. There's always, within respect for rubrics and hopefully lots of thinking hard before rubrics get broken, where there's really good reason when that happens. But there's always, it's always the case that there are little edges being pushed in various places, sometimes pretty radically pushed in various places. So some of that will be at the, with the bishop's imprimatur, and sometimes parishes in the Episcopal Church are just kind of practicing and experimenting a little bit, and they really haven't had a conversation without the bishop about it. The bishop's usually aware of it, but there's not anything particularly egregious. Nobody worries about it. And we do know that liturgy, the longer you practice it, the more likely it will begin to be adapted. Because one of the sort of fascinating things about liturgical practice is that it contains the seeds of its own revision and renewal. When you practice new liturgical forms for a while, there's a lot of time spent living into those forms and learning how to do them well. Once they become second nature, precisely because the liturgy succeeds in forming people in a particular direction, over time, it will then become evident what that particular received set of liturgical forms doesn't do as well. So the longer you go, the more experimentation and adaptation begins to happen. And that's in the context of a church in which, even with our Book of Common Prayer, as I said a moment ago, it's never really been the case that no matter where you go in the Episcopal Church on a given Sunday, you're going to find exactly the same thing being done. And that was true even when we had the 1928 prayer book, when there were not multiple forms for us to work with. So when you have a book like the 79, which makes a substantial shift by multiplying the forms that are available for certain parts of the liturgy, well, then of course you're going to end up with a great deal more diversity, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. So this committee also has found itself in collecting things that people are doing, also collecting proposals and ideas, and there has been some writing around this, as liturgical leaders in the church have been asked to do some thinking about it. There's a book out from Church Publishing from not too long ago called In Spirit and in Truth, in which a number of us in the liturgical guild do some thinking about where we might be going, or where we might need to be going as we do liturgical adaptation and renewal. And so basically what the resolution at General Convention did is open up a space for us to continue with the 79 book, but also with oversight from ecclesiastical authorities to begin to experiment and explore the range of experiments that are available out there in the church as we start to move towards some liturgical adaptation and change. I take the drift of this decision and the debate at General Convention to be a pretty good indicator of where it is that we're heading in the future. Now, since that's my third topic, I'm going to wait and circle back to that in a little bit. But certainly the shape of the decision that General Convention made, the way that they decided to move through this, actually indicates something broader and deeper that seems to be a shift in liturgical mood, for lack of a better term, and liturgical practice. And so we'll reconnect with that General Convention decision a bit when we come back around to the third part of my talk today. With that as background, then, let me just think for a little bit with you about what we've learned in the last half century. And I want to repeat myself and say, this is not an exhaustive list, and you will think of other things that I don't tag, but there's some method to my madness in terms of why I'm naming the things that I am naming, because they do relate to where we're probably going, and not just what we've learned since the liturgical movement in the 20th century. So here's the first one. And some of this will also overlap with what we've learned in the pandemic, although I'll say some more about what we've learned there when we get to that point. One thing it seems to me that we have learned in the last half century, fully and clearly and seriously in most places, is that we have learned how to be an assembly. When I teach prayer book, and I suspect my colleagues in the other seminaries find themselves in the same spot, I always say that you have to teach the theology of a prayer book and the practice of a prayer book differentially, by which I mean you can't really figure out what's important to a particular prayer book unless you compare it to other prayer books that went before it. That's becoming more and more of a challenge in teaching, because when I started out, however many years ago I started doing this full-time, 25 years ago, 21 years ago, it was very common for me to look out over a classroom in a liturgy class and to ask for a show of hands of everyone in that class who had any experience celebrating with the 1928 book, and many, many, many hands would go up. As you know where I'm going here, as you would expect, that's no longer the case. Even in, shall we say, age-mixed classrooms, many of the folks at the higher end of the age range in the classroom have no memory of using the 28 book at this point. And certainly our younger students, of whom there actually are many, in fact, we're seeing a real surge kind of downward in age again at Virginia Seminary, at least for the last 2-3 years. That can sometimes change on a dime. But, you know, for most of my students, they don't know a thing about the 28 prayer book. The only forms of worship they've ever worshiped with are the forms in the 1979 prayer book. So it's important in teaching them to get them to look at least a few features of the 28 book in order to see what some of the important shifts were. And certainly one of those shifts was the desire to have everyone in the room, as it were, understand themselves as an active and engaged participant in the liturgical action. While that theology wasn't invented in the 1970s or the 1960s or 50s, it was a shift for Episcopalians, for whom often enough the way the 1928 prayer book was celebrated was very much a sense that the clergy and sometimes lay leaders in front of the room, whether literally or figuratively, were the folks sort of driving the train and everybody else was kind of following along. And it does seem to me that there has been a great degree of success in our folks understanding now that the liturgy belongs to the whole assembly, that is a practice of the assembly, and the leadership roles involved in that practice are a matter of differentiation of roles. And the whole assembly is involved, being led by the priest or a deacon in some cases, or lay leader, depending on the liturgies and so forth. That's a good thing, I think. I think that in some ways would be in a contest for just a couple of other things to be number one at the top of the list for liturgical catechesis that was coming out of the 20th century liturgical movement. So we've learned to be an assembly. And I will circle back to that because that's very much relevant to what happened to us in the pandemic. We've also learned to embrace liturgical diversity. Now, a moment ago, I said it's never been the case that every Episcopal church was doing liturgy the same way. It's never been the case. But it was always the case more as a kind of open secret. And the mythology that we were all bound together around a single book that dictated the way we did worship in every single congregation that you would visit in the Episcopal Church, that mythology was high on our corporate consciousness 30 years ago. And I think we now all know, and it's been a function of the diversity of forms within the 79 book itself, that you will move from one Episcopal church to the other and find a great deal of diversity in liturgical forms, liturgical piety and spirituality, practices of the assembly, schedules, use of supplemental resources, along with things like, you know, the supplemental resources we've all long had, like the Book of Occasional Services, and then along with the 79 book as well. Our diversity is no longer an open secret. It's actually woven into our liturgical life in a way that it was not woven in before. It's right there in the book and the supplements for everyone to see, that there are a range of authorized resources, and Episcopal churches will exercise quite a bit of discretion in moving among those supplemental resources and figuring out what to do in their local setting. That too, I will come back around to. Thirdly, very clearly, we have learned that Eucharist is the proper liturgy of the Lord's Day. We are now overwhelmingly a Eucharistic church. If measured by what congregations and communities and parishes consider their principal liturgy in their local context, we are overwhelmingly a right to Eucharistic church. Do hear the subtleties of that clearly. That is not to suggest that Rite One is disappearing or is not being used. It's used quite widely, but there's no question that in terms of our consciousness around what we take to be our principal liturgies, most congregations will identify their central service to be one that uses a right to form of the liturgy. But the Eucharist is clearly the center of the Lord's Day. And largely, we have learned the concomitant lesson that baptism belongs in the Eucharistic assembly and occurs on the Lord's Day. Now, I will say, and this is entirely anecdotal, but I do get around a fair amount, that I'm seeing a little bit of slippage on that in recent years. I have found myself encountering situations where baptisms are being done privately a little bit more often than I was seeing 20 years ago. I have no special insight on why that is occurring, unless it is really just a matter of the kind of gradual disintegration that tends to happen after a long arc following revision, where people kind of lose the center a little bit and it has to be, you know, revisited. It may just be that. But by and large, baptisms are done in the assembly. We understand the significance of baptism to the assembly. It's linked to the Eucharist, and we understand the Eucharist as the principal liturgy that Christians do when they gather on major feasts and principal feasts and on the Lord's Day. There are some things that, this is again kind of anecdotal, but informed anecdotal, if that's a fair category. I do see a bit of slippage in some places around what we had learned around confirmation, making sure that confirmation was done in a way that clearly held up the centrality and primacy of baptism as the signal initiation into the Christian community. And I think we have a new generation of bishops, some of whom are not quite as on target in the way they think about doing confirmation. And so there's probably some work to continue to be done there. Of course, that's probably not a big surprise because confirmation has always been a bit of a puzzle for us. And that goes back to the history of an attempt to create a prayer book where confirmation was renamed as reaffirmation and consolidated the notion of that liturgy as one of several forms that any adult might undertake to renew their baptismal vows. That did not pass. So we got instead in the 79 prayer book a confirmation rite that left us a little bit of difficulty sorting out how that related to our commitment in the 79 book that baptism was the thing that really mattered. So there's going to still be some learning to be done there, I think. A couple of other things I've seen kind of slipping backward a little bit. Probably the Triduum principle among them. As lovely and as powerful as those liturgies are, I think I run into more clergy these days, certainly than I did 2 decades ago, who opt to omit one or another of the liturgies of the Sacred Triduum, or so significantly adapt it that it bears no resemblance to the prayer book rite, whether it be the Great Vigil or Maundy Thursday or Good Friday. The primary issues being around Good Friday and the Triduum, I would say. And there are just a rising number of clergy that I meet who kind of won't take on the Triduum precisely because it is so incredibly demanding to plan and train and staff. And I find that most disconcerting, because that is one of the richest contributions of the 79 prayer book, and one of the most powerful evangelical and formational liturgies that we have. And by that, I mean the whole sweep of the 3 days. So we've learned perhaps from that we still need to get more people doing the Triduum, but I'm becoming convinced, as I wasn't a few years ago, that we probably need to produce Triduum liturgies that have a little bit clearer shape and stronger rubrics to them, because the way in which particularly the vigil is structured leaves an awful lot of responsibility on local leadership, clergy, vergers, lay leaders, bulletin producers, and so forth, to figure out exactly how to put that together. So it may mean that we have learned that we need to provide a little clearer structure and guidance on how to do the liturgies of the Triduum. Now, there again are other things that could be said, but I actually want to shift gears at this point and talk a little bit about what we have learned in the pandemic, because some of what we've learned there relates to some of what I've just said. First thing that we learned, I think, in the pandemic is that as much as we have moved along as a church in our understanding of the sacraments, we still have a long way to go in terms of education around sacramental theology. Now, I have no doubt that there will be, diverse opinions among the group I'm speaking to, but for the moment, while I have the microphone, let me simply say, by no measure of our received sacramental theology can something like virtual communion be justified. And chief among the problems with it, and a place where I think we've discovered we need to do more teaching as a result, is that the nature of the Eucharistic assembly needs to be one in which people are together in their bodies, gathered as a function of their baptismal identity, with people who would not be among their friend groups in some case, right? I mean, in any given congregation, you don't love everybody you're together there with, but you're together because you've been reconstituted as a new body through baptism. Eucharist then becomes the ongoing sustaining of the creation of a new community. And there is something so intrinsic to the gathering of bodies in a single space there, that beyond all the other things that can be said about the importance of materiality in the sacraments, the significance of an incarnational theology, and so forth, it is clear that we've got to revisit again just how significant the in-person assembly is to Eucharistic practice. The way that I have come to talk about that these days, after being through these, conversations, debates, discussions, occasionally battles over the next year and a half, as everybody in good conscience has tried to do the best they could in this weird moment for liturgy while we were in pandemic lockdown. But the way I've come to try to say this to people is that the assembly is actually constitutive of the sacramentality of the Eucharist. That's the fancy academic way to say it. Let me say that again and then I'll unpack it. The assembly is constitutive of the sacramentality of the Eucharist. What I mean by that is the Eucharist is not a magic act confected by priests who have the magic hands and do the thing, and it just happens to be that the norm for where we do that is within a Christian assembly. That is not our sacramental theology. That is, Hooker would be turning over in his grave, who in many ways was closer to Calvin than we think he was, in that what Hooker was really interested in was, he didn't deny real presence, but his interest was in the assembly's real participation in Christ through the Eucharistic action, such that we want to say that the assembly is not the container where the sacrament occurs. It's not the event. It's not the moment in time or the happenstance gathering where then the sacrament occurs. The gathering of the assembly is one of the essential inputs to the sacrament. It is the eating together by a body drawn together through baptism, eating a bread that is one, that is broken for many, so that many in the eating can become one. And there is absolutely no way to imitate that by people having bread and wine in front of their cameras at home and listening to a priest recite the Eucharistic prayer and then eating your own bread and wine with people with whom you are gathered because they happen to be biological family or roommates or something. They are not eating together because they have been reconstituted as a new family in anticipation of the new creation that God is bringing to pass, of which the church is a sign. Not only can the virtual assembly not do that, the virtual assembly actually probably works against it, works in the opposite direction, because we are so touched in so much of what we do by the modern preoccupation with spectacle and with consumption. And it is just too natural for us to get on a screen, dial in where we want to dial in, watch what we want, provide our own bread. It's too easy for that to become a practice of visual consumerism. It is not the kind of assembly that a Eucharistic assembly is. Now, with that last comment, let me say, I am prepared to say that a digital gathering is a certain kind of assembly. The operative theological question is it the kind of assembly that is appropriate to how we understand what's going on in the Eucharist? And the answer to that is a resounding no. It's just not. Now, this is aside from questions about what sort of, detailed stopgap, momentary, temporary, whatever kind of things we might want to do to navigate this space. And there's all kinds of shades of practices that get closer to Eucharistic assembly that some congregations have relied on during this time, and that would keep us here for hours to talk through all of those. But the basic important point here is that we have learned that we still have more teaching to do about the sacrament. Even though, as I said, we have learned to take the assembly more seriously as actively engaged in the liturgy, it appears to me that we did not learn that what comes along with that is also the notion that the assembly is a contributive element of the sacramental action and not simply the place where the sacramental action happens to occur up at the table. Of course, it also reinforces, I'm afraid, all kinds of clericalism as well when we do a kind of virtual communion thing where we're just imagining that we just got to get the priest who has the magic on the screen to do the magic for us so that we can do this in some sort of dispersed way. So we've had some real sobering wake-up calls there as a result of the pandemic about what we do and don't know regarding the relationship of the assembly to the sacramentality of the action. The second thing I would say that we have learned during this period, and again, we could go farther and say more, but I'm just going to tag these two, is now, if I sound like too much of a, hard case with regard to virtual communion, let me say on the other side that I think we have been invited by our experience of this period to rethink how we might be using digital tools. There are a number of ways in which I think digital tools could be put to use to extend the church's ministry that we have learned during this period. It's certainly not the first time we've tried this sort of thing, but its previous iteration was realized in the, fairly small number of congregations in the Episcopal Church around the country that might, when TV was the primary screen that we looked at, broadcast their Sunday Eucharist so that shut-ins could see the Eucharist who were prevented from coming to the assembly in an ongoing, sustained way. Now, the way we might think about using that, the digital skills that we have learned in this period, it seems to me, is to couple that with practices we already engage in with regard to Eucharistic ministry to those who cannot come to the assembly in a sustained way. Let's think for a second about where we are and what we do about that now, and then what could digital usage add to that? So how does that work now? We gather on a Sunday morning, the assembly celebrates Eucharist, and then we send lay Eucharistic ministers, or the priest himself or herself may go right after the meeting of the assembly, or hopefully very soon after. That's the best practice. And we'll take the Eucharist, the Eucharistic elements that had been consecrated at the assembly's gathering immediately to those who are shut in. Notice that's sort of an exception that proves the rule of the importance of assembly. If folks can't come, nevertheless, we send to them elements that have just been consecrated from the assembly to gather them in. And in fact, best practice on that, which I'm afraid not everybody has caught, is that the lay Eucharistic ministers receive the elements and exit the church with them immediately after the people's communion and before the post-communion prayer. What that is instantiating by practice is the extension of the assembly's Eucharist to those to whom the elements are being taken. All right, you know how that works. I'm sure you work with limbs and so forth, and do some of the orchestrating around that and the point in the service when they come and get the bread and wine and there's a prayer or a sending and, out they go. Well, what would it be like if on top of that defensible and normative practice for taking Eucharist to those who can't be with the assembly for a sustained period or maybe permanently, what would it be like if we were also streaming that Eucharist so that they could watch the assembly's Eucharistic gathering, from which very shortly thereafter, they're going to receive the bread and wine? That seems to me to be an example of how some hybrid practice, if we could get good at it. And not everybody's going to be able to do that immediately, and you've got to train and you've got to learn how to do the digital skills well, and you got to have the equipment and all of that. But if we could do that, we would then have a situation where we still don't have the ideal solution, which is that somebody who can't be with the assembly would get brought to the assembly somehow. But some folks simply can't. They might be immune compromised, or there might be mobility issues. What would it mean if, in addition to bringing them the assembly's Eucharist immediately after the gathering, they had also been able to hear the word, to hear the sermon preached, to see the people who are part of their communion, part of their community on the web, and then very shortly thereafter be brought the communion that they watched be celebrated by that assembly? That violates none of our basic sacramental principles, works with an exception proving the rule that we already use anyway, and might deepen the connection of those who can't be present with us with the assembly. The motivation of that is entirely, as you no doubt intuit, pastoral. I mean, it's liturgical, but it's also pastoral liturgical. So that's one example of the way we might use digital tools more. I suspect beyond liturgy, there are a great deal of other avenues that we might go down in using digital connection when we're talking about kinds of assemblies where the body-to-body presence of the assembly together is not an essential element of its meaning. Even if it might be preferable, there are kinds of gatherings that we can do that are less harmed by being virtual and not incarnationally gathered in bodies than the Eucharist is harmed by our doing communion in that way. And of course, I'm not really going into it, but I hope you just kind of assume as a matter of course that, that there are other kinds of things that one can do with the Eucharistic liturgy short of the act of communion that are probably more defensible. For example, doing the liturgy of the word from the Eucharist online when we were not able to gather, that's probably defensible. It's the act of communion itself that requires a presence and materiality that just can't be separated out from the sacramentality of the action itself. So we'll have some more thoughts about that, and I'll be interested to hear in the Q&A or comments if you have some thoughts about how we might use digital tools going forward. All right, let's take a breath. That's kind of some things we've learned over the last 50 years or so since the liturgical movement. Those are two of the things that I think are most pressing that we have learned from this time in the pandemic when we were not able for a while to gather together. I could go on with that, but I want to make sure I leave enough time to sort of look forward too. So I will look forward now for a moment, and you know, maybe we'll come back to some of the stuff from the pandemic if you want to. But what is ahead of us? What is ahead of us? This much seems to me to be very, very clear. Not because I'm a soothsayer, but because it's right in front of us under our noses and we can see it's where we're going. It started with the 79 book itself, and that was a shift from a book held in common that was practiced with some local variation to a book that actually enshrines a variety of practices within a rite or a ritual structure, and therefore valorizes the idea that diversity in liturgical practice is likely simply to continue to amplify in the Episcopal Church. This is exactly what we see going on and have seen for some time in working with the Book of Common Prayer, but continually reauthorizing and continually adding to materials like, for example, the 5 volumes of Enriching Our Worship that we have. Actually, we may be considering the Marriage Rites Volume 6 now. I'm not sure about that, but we have bought into a model in which an authorized book itself, with certain diversity enshrined within it, is joined by the use of other authorized resources meant to supplement that book. Now, they're not standalones. They're meant to be supplements of the received framework and the Paschal theology of the 79 prayer book. What I think that means we're headed toward, and this I think is a lot bigger than it will sound when I say it, but I think it is an enormous shift in terms of liturgical leadership, which is where it comes to bear on clergy formation, and certainly will come to bear on your lives as vergers, to the extent that you are, different vergers do different things, I know this, but to the extent that as a verger you're involved in any way in the kind of planning of liturgical practice in your local community, you will feel this come home if you're not feeling it already. And that is that we are moving rapidly toward a model of liturgical curation. We are moving rapidly toward a model of liturgical curation. We do not have a book that we simply turn to, read out of it, or lift out of it, even with a little bit of diversity from the book itself, but largely just following what's there. We are instead faced with a stack of resources on the desk in front of us. A stack of resources for liturgical practice that we draw from to plan the liturgical practices for any given day. By the way, I'm aware that my camera has gotten a little fuzzy, but presumably you can still hear me, so that's all right. Not quite sure why it's out of focus, but rather than try to stop and take time to fix that, I'll just keep going unless I become a complete blur. So curation of liturgy. We're going to have liturgical leaders, both clergy and lay, who are deeply acculturated to and familiar with the full range of liturgical possibilities that are authorized, how they are used and put together with one another, and a discerning sense of how to go about matching liturgical forms appropriately to the life of the particular congregation that is being served. That is a different model. There's been a certain kind of curation that we've been headed toward ever since the 79 book, but it's been curation largely between the covers of this book, right? But the framework now is much wider. You have, you know, a calendar, if we can ever get used to, if we can ever settle sort of what we want the calendar to look like. That's been a saga all of its own. But we have a calendar of lesser feasts. We have 5 volumes of EOW, Enriching Our Worship. Not all of them are for the Sunday gathering, but there are many other resources there of pastoral nature, burial rites, a new rite to celebrate a new ministry, prayers particularly centered around the experience of women and others in issues around childbearing or the loss of a child. We have all of these things. Then we have the Book of Occasional Services, which has always had additional resources within it as well. But now we've got other things coming out of General Convention too. Just one example is the expansive language version of Rite 2. I don't know if that slipped across the radar without you really noticing it. I think it probably did for some people, but there is a trial rite status, expansive language Rite 2, for the use of the church that was passed at the last General Convention. So you've got those kind of things coming as well that we're going to be increasingly asked to experiment with, to test, to evaluate in prayer, and to see how these things might be used in our congregational life. There are some other things we're headed toward, and I'm going to wrap up my remarks by naming those things. First of all, it seems pretty clear that we are headed toward a yet another run at baptismal formation. While we've had a great deal of success on that, there is still work to be done in enhancing and lifting up baptismal ministry in such a way that we view that as the center of our life as church, and not just something that the lay people do as sort of an add-on to what happens on Sunday morning at the ritual. So there is probably more catechesis to be done there. And in fact, for those who were reluctant to move to a new prayer book, one of the principal arguments you would hear launched for that is that we still haven't gone as deeply into the baptismal theology of this book as we might have. Now, some of us agree about that, some of us disagree, and some of us think the situation is a little more to receive some caveats in terms of where we actually are. But that probably is a significant kind of catechesis that we need to continue to be doing. Secondly, expansive language is probably here to stay. Expansive language is more than inclusive language. I trust you know this, the terminology that we've gone to here. Inclusive language was a concern first and initially with gender balance, where that was possible within liturgical language, biblical language, theological language. And that very quickly gave way to the expansive language movement, which recognizes that in addition to underused gender riches in the biblical and subsequent tradition, that there are all kinds of other images that we use for God, for the church, for Christian life that have been rather underplayed in the liturgical history of the church. And so there are going to continue to be new images and metaphors as we stretch a bit and gather up a bit more of the underused biblical imagery that is not just restricted to, you know, God is person-like and male-like, right? God is not a person, God is not male, but, you know, person-like and male-like in the sense that we have received this kind of sanctioned usage in our Trinitarian language for the notion of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that's surely coming down the line. We've already begun to work on better translation. And we are clear as a bell, I hope, at this point, that the way we did the translation of the 79 book was not the way to do a good translation. We have an increasingly multilingual church, particularly the use of Spanish is on the rise. And what we did with the 79 book was basically craft the book from the ground up. It was crafted in English, and then we had it translated. And what we ended up with was a pretty bad translation of the Spanish. And any of you who are Spanish speakers realize how absent some of the idiomatic usage in Spanish is, and how artificial some of the language that's actually in the Spanish language prayer book. My colleague, Juan Oliver, has just finished translating, doing a better translation of the book. And we are going to need in the future, whenever we craft liturgical resources, to have language speakers in the room that are not just English speakers, so that these liturgies get formed from the ground up in the linguistic idiom that will be authentic to the communities that celebrate them. So that is something we've learned the hard way by kind of realizing how bad the Spanish language sort of non-dynamic translation was from the 79 book. Another thing that we're headed toward, and I'm going to stop with this so that we have a little time for feedback, questions, comments. General Convention didn't do anything with it in 2018, but they did not refrain from doing anything with this because there's not the will to do it. They refrained, I think, rather, I believe I'm interpreting this correctly, they refrained from what I'm about to describe, any development of resources in what I'm about to describe, because we were in the middle of a larger conversation about what prayer book revision was going to look like if we even wanted to do that, or how we were going to proceed with liturgical renewal and kind of begin to explore what is in fact being practiced out there in the Episcopal Church, and what might then emerge out of that as resources for us. So we haven't really moved on this in any formal way with the resolutions at General Convention. None of them passed, as I recall. But I'm speaking here of resolutions pertaining to the prominence of creation and the significance, particularly in this moment of climate crisis, of bringing more deeply into the fabric of our language of prayer some attention to creation, the significance of creation as itself a blessing, the weight of stewardship that comes with us in recognizing that the heavens themselves tell of the glory of God, and we have some responsibility for protecting and preserving and serving a creation that has a kind of sacramentality for us. What that's going to look like is you know, we're waiting to see. But there may be creation liturgies. There has been some discussion of a creation season. And of course, the presiding bishop has put out a kind of a, you know, a stopgap kind of set of lections for a creation season to be observed this fall for those who want to do it. I must say, and you know, all respect to our presiding bishop, but I must say that there's a lot of misunderstanding out there at the moment about what liturgical seasons are about. And the idea of just dropping a creation season into the middle of fall because in the Northern Hemisphere the leaves are changing is not a very robust understanding of the Christological nature of the liturgical seasons. So if we're going to have a creation season, it's probably going to need to be called something other than the creation season, and it's going to need to be a lot more closely interwoven with the Christological significance of the way our liturgical seasons unfold. But that may be coming in some form as well. There was another example of this is a resolution at General Convention to add responsibility for creation as the part of the language of our baptismal rite. To fold that in. Again, that was not passed, not because I think there's no taste for it, but because there was a sense that we needed to do this a bit more comprehensively and think about it within the larger progress that we're trying to make in liturgical renewal and revision. All right, I'm going to stop there. I think I went about 50 minutes if I was looking correctly at my my clock. And I'm happy at this point to kind of hand back over to whoever's going to moderate this. And if you've got questions, if I can answer them, I will. If I can't, I'll make something up and try to sound like I know what I'm talking about. And also happy to hear comments that you think are for the good of the order based on any of the things that I've had to say.
Well, Dr. Farwell, thank you. Several of us have been texting back and forth about how awesome your presentation has been. I will open the floor up for any questions that may be out there. I will dare to allow you to unmute yourself, but please respect others. And if you have a question and there's a break, feel free to unmute yourself and pose anything you think that for the good of the order. And it went dead silent.
I'll start. I have a question.
Go ahead, Mike.
James, thank you so much for being here. Your presentation was really, really fascinating and life-giving. It's for me. It's we were talking about in our breakout group yesterday that the change we're living through is both unsettling and yet reassuring of how much we are committed to being the body of Christ in the world and serving the church through a diversity of ways. The question I have for you, though, comes from our breakout group. There were 6 or 7 of us last night, I think, in my breakout group. It was just a social hour to get to know each other. And I believe all but maybe one or two of us, in terms of the churches that we serve in, are without a rector. And in some cases, the diocese that the verger was serving in had multiple churches, multiple buildings, parishes without a rector. And we just talked about how increasingly more common and difficult it has been. And the pandemic certainly plays a role in that. But I'm curious if you're aware of any discussions surrounding additional responsibilities or opportunities for either the laity or the deacon, the ministry of the deacon, for example, to step up in additional ways outside of how they are currently engaged in the 79 prayer book, and what that might look like.
That's a great question. It's not something that I spend a lot of time directly consulting on, but I would certainly say that the question you've raised, or the whole kind of cluster of needs and issues that are connected to the question that you raised, sometimes feel at this point, certainly in seminary world, like the only thing that we're talking about. So I can't say specifically what might need to occur in the way of expanding roles of lay leadership or things that deacons would do. And of course, in our polity, there will be national discussion of that, but there will also be a lot of authority exercised by the bishop, by the ordinary, about what that's actually going to look like in their particular diocese. But certainly the conversation is going on. We have no shortage of people coming through to be priests. I don't care what the data says about the church shrinking and less people. I mean, we're swamped with applications. And I believe that every one of the other, healthy, vital seminaries at this point, whatever particular form of curriculum they do, whether it's sort of partly hybrid like CDSP or fully present like Sewanee or Southwest, I believe they're all pretty full too. The question seems to be around dwindling economic resources to afford full-time clergy. The question also seems to be around the gradual diminishing of size of congregations that may actually require us to recalibrate a little bit how we think about what constitutes a parish, and particularly with smaller parishes, what could their relationship be to larger resource kinds of places. And I have to tell you, and now I'm speaking just very much for myself, although I'm sure this is not original with me, one of the models that we ought to be looking at, I think, in a situation where many small parishes are not going to be continue to be viable in the sense of being able to afford a priest full-time. One of the models we need to be looking at is what they're doing in the African churches. The model they have with a very large resource parish, in some cases that is the cathedral, but not in all cases, where a dean, or whatever equivalent term they use for that, and a number of clergy are attached to that resource parish, and then go out in a kind of satellite relationship to bring the sacraments on a certain kind of schedule to smaller communities that are attached to that large resource parish, where in those communities, lay people are in fact taking very serious liturgical roles. I mean, this is very common in a number of dioceses in Africa. It's common in Myanmar, where I used to take a group of students until everything went to hell there recently. And other places in Asia. We probably need to be looking at that model. And that kind of model is probably the only thing, if anything, is going to save. It's probably the only thing that's going to save really small Episcopal communities who just aren't going to be able to afford one of the people that's coming through our doors in the seminary on a full-time basis, but who might be not just yoked together with each other, which is a model we do know something about, and a lot of dioceses do that sort of thing, but yoke them together in a sort of larger super community where a number of clergy could be responsible for those satellites while raising up very robust lay leadership in both catechesis and Bible study and pastoral care. I think that's the kind of model that might hold the solution, at least for some of our dioceses. Bottom line, whether we go toward that or something else, the most certain thing I can give you in response to your question is we are talking about this all the time at this point and trying to feel our way forward toward what the best model is going to be for the sustenance of the church.
Anybody else have a question for the doctor? Christine, if you'll.
Yes. My question is, I'm a stewardship junkie. I've been involved in stewardship in one way or another for the past 12 years, including for the Diocese of El Camino Real in California. And one of the things that concerns me is that the clergy are still, and many people are still embarrassed by the subject. And I'm not talking about stewardship money. I'm talking about stewardship as far as our duty. And it is our primary duty. And I think you mentioned that in what you said. And I'm wondering whether the seminaries have a way of helping the clergy to be a little more brave about approaching the subject and talking about it more than they appear to be willing.
Yeah, a little beyond my expertise, but certainly, you know, as a member now of full-time of 2 seminary faculties and some affiliate work in other seminaries over the years of my career, and thinking back all the way to my own formation as a priest, so this was in the late 80s at General Seminary, I don't believe we ever had a conversation about stewardship ever. Of any kind, money or otherwise, when I was a student at General. Now there's lots of conversation about that. We actually at VTS, but I'm going to tell you this as sort of an icon of what I imagine you would find in our sister seminaries as well. We did a little project, I want to say it was about 5 years back now, and I think it may have even been in connection with something the National Church was asking us to do. I didn't have point on it, I don't remember all those details, but we spent some time as a faculty surfacing where and in what courses we were talking about stewardship, with the concern that we might not be talking about it anywhere. And it turned out we actually were talking about it in a lot of places. It came up in the biblical courses as a biblical principle. It came up in practical theology and courses preparing for leadership. And there was even a move in the church, and you may be plugged into this because this is an area you care about. Even the last convention in 2018 had a resolution in front of that. I don't remember exactly what the resolution was or where it went, but a resolution around developing a theology of money. So while stewardship is bigger than money, we also need to learn to talk about money, because in our world, money is a significant currency for the sharing of resources. So time and talent is great. We need to be doing that, but we also need to be able to talk to people without getting red in the face about money. So that is to say that there is conversation at the national level about the need to be better at this. And if my seminary is any indication, we do in fact talk to students about this in a number of courses across the curriculum, which frankly is a better way to teach something. Students take away more when several courses touch it over the course of their, 3 years or 2 years, whatever they're here. So we are talking about this. Are we getting any better at it? I don't know. I mean, I have anecdotally better in some places, not in others, I think is what I would say.
Thank you.
Duke, you're muted.
Hey, this is Scott Smith from Trinity Church Wall Street, and I hope I'm unmuted. I can't really tell.
You are.
All right, thanks. I am one thrilled that you were here speaking to us today, because it's just given me so many things to think about, and it's so timely. The thing that I find most interesting about kind of the forward looking of the follow on of, you know, clergy and those who work with clergy like vergers, sacristans, and worship leaders and others, about kind of curating from these many different resources. So you mentioned in your presentation about having a large number of additional books, and I think we many on this in this meeting know far too well about that we do have Book of Occasional Services and Enriching Our Worship and all of these. We already have some resources that we're adding, and now we're looking forward to more, which is really cool. But I'm curious if the church, the Episcopal Church in particular, is looking towards technology to try to help us learn and assimilate all of those resources. Kind of the last thing for me in the 21st century that I want to have is a bunch of books. I really want to have you know, tools like Right Planning from Church Publishing and others that would allow us to more easily put those things together. Do you see that as maybe a companion to Zoom and some of the other technology pieces that we have in dealing with the curation of liturgy moving forward, when we're talking less about books than we are the process around that, if that makes sense?
Makes a great deal of sense. And the short answer is yes. The longer answer is we're sort of feeling our way, given the particular authority structure that we have, about what that might look like. But I think so. I was just having this conversation with someone else yesterday. We are, so let me say this and let me then add a caveat. We are behind now in a way that in the 70s, we actually were ahead. Certainly not of the Roman Catholics, but of other Reformed traditions in the way of revision and liturgical theology, and, you know, all the things that we're doing there. And now, not only are there other communions that have books that I really must say, I'm hard pressed not occasionally to say are not much better books than ours. Tenure is a great thing. They can't fire me for saying that, but I really, you know, the Presbyterian book or the Lutheran resources in many ways, I think, you know, outshine us. Now, there are things that we do very well in our book as well. But where they really outshine us is in not so much retiring books and paper and material objects, but in terms of the resources, the way you're talking about it, they put it all online. And I got to tell you, if the Episcopal Church could establish something like what in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, our mutual communion partners, have established online that they call Sundays and Seasons, we would be set to go. That is a brilliant website, which I only have access to because I happen to be in a seminary and we also do Lutheran liturgies here. And I need to be able to teach students how Lutheran liturgies are done, because with our mutual communion agreement, you know, Episcopalians could become a pastor of an ELCA church and vice versa. Most Episcopalians are not going to have a reason to have access to that or subscribe to it, but it is terrific. And I'm happy to say that I have heard a number of conversations by Nancy Bryan and others at Church Publishing that they are thinking about ways of establishing a similar kind of website of resources for us. You know, we took a couple of runs at this with Right Brain and Right Song, and then it became Right something else. Anyway, I mean, back when I was in parish ministry, I used to use those routinely, but they were a little clunky, not at all as easy to use as the really fine website that ELCA has put together. And I suspect that we will head in that direction. Now, here's my caveat. I think in the same way that the complete death of brick and mortar bookstores was reported rather prematurely, and there's now a resurgence of brick and mortar bookstores, although not the big monsters that ate the little ones up. You know, the book is probably here to stay. The pattern in the history of technological development, if you're thinking about technology broadly, is that in each era, when a new form of technology emerges, it doesn't displace the older one. It simply comes alongside of it and becomes a new part of the mix. So I think we will have online resources, but I also think it's possible if we get to the point where, I don't know when, 12 years from now, 15 years from now, we have kind of come to a watershed in this process of liturgical experimentation that we're in, and have settled on some particular ritual resources that we think really have legs as supplements that we kind of want to keep. I would not be at all surprised if we went the same way that Canada has gone and England has gone, and established something like a supplemental book that would gather all these things in one place and be a companion with the 79 prayer book, so that we actually don't have 8 or 9 books worth of material. We've actually winnowed through practice. We've figured out what works. We've prayed through it. We've done our process like we do with liturgy. And there might then be a single book that gather all these resources in one place. But I do not think that that will undermine the move toward establishing a central digital website of some kind where people responsible for planning can get access to this stuff and work with it. I mean, I'm partly arguing that we should, but I do know, in fact, that, you know, people in the publishing world are thinking about that for the Episcopal Church as well. And I think we'll get, I don't know when it'll be or what form it'll be in, but I think we will. I think church publishing has something out there new now that I haven't worked with, but I think there will probably be yet another iteration of that, and we will get better at that as we go. That's a good question. Thank you.
Well, thank you much. We've got a couple of other hands up, but our time is at an end. I hate to do that to the few hands that are up that want to speak, but if I don't wrap this one up, we don't get the next session going. So Dr. Farwell, thank you, thank you, thank you. You have been very enlightening and giving us a lot of food for thought. I only wish I could sit in your classes on a more regular basis. But thank you very much. And with that, I will draw this session to a close and remind everybody that we're back in about 15 minutes on the other Zoom channel. Again, thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. Bye.